It was just past midnight when the rain began to fall harder. The kind of rain that soaks through clothes and bones alike. The kind that makes the world feel smaller and lonelier than it already is. And somewhere beneath that steady downpour was a sound that didn't belong. A child's muffled sob, thin and frightened, echoing against concrete and rusted steel near a forgotten garage most people barely noticed during the day, let alone at night, and anyone else would have driven right past it. Windows rolled up, radio on, hearts locked away for self-preservation, but that night, one exhausted single father slowed his car, and that single decision quietly bent the path of several lives in a direction none of them could have predicted, because sometimes the people who look the most shattered are carrying stories far heavier than the world ever bothered to ask about. And before this story truly begins, take a second to subscribe to the channel. Like this video, and leave your thoughts in the comments, because your support allows us to keep sharing real, emotional stories that remind us how powerful simple kindness can be. And now, let me tell you what really happened that night. My name is Daniel, and I wasn't anyone special, just a worn-down single dad trying to survive, scraping by one paycheck at a time, working long hours as a mechanic in a small neighborhood garage tucked into a forgotten stretch of Ohio pavement, fixing cars that had seen better decades for people who paid me mostly in cash and quiet appreciation. And life had taken its share from me already, but I didn't complain much, because my little girl Lily was everything I had left, my reason for waking up every morning and dragging myself through another day, and every night after work. No matter how tired my hands were or how heavy my head felt, I rushed home to her, because even in the middle of struggle, we still had each other, and that was enough. That night, though, I stayed late at the garage, later than usual, finishing up a stubborn repair while rain hammered down on the roof like it was trying to get inside, and by the time I pulled the heavy metal shutter down, my back ached and my shirt was damp with sweat and oil, and that's when I noticed something in the alley beside the building, a shape that didn't move when I expected it to, a human shape, slumped against the brick wall under a flickering light, and as my eyes adjusted, my stomach tightened, because there was a woman sitting there, her coat torn and soaked through, her face swollen and bruised in places no one deserved to be hit, and pressed tightly against her side was a young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, clinging to her like she was the only solid thing left in the world, his small body trembling, his head buried against her shoulder as quiet sobs escaped him despite his effort to be brave. I froze where I stood, keys still in my hand, because fear hits first in moments like that, fear of getting involved, fear of doing the wrong thing, fear of not being able to protect the people you already love, and then responsibility followed right behind it, heavy and unavoidable, because all I could think about was Lily, and how I'd pray with everything in me that someone, anyone, would stop and help her if I wasn't around, and that thought didn't give me a choice anymore, so I grabbed my jacket, pulled it tight against the rain, and walked toward them slowly, making sure my voice stayed calm when I spoke, asking softly if they were okay, even though it was obvious they weren't. The woman lifted her head at the sound of my voice, and her eyes were swollen and rimmed red, but there was something else there too, something unbroken, something strong despite everything she'd clearly been through, and she shook her head slightly before speaking, her voice barely above the rain as she asked if we could please just have a safe place for the night, and the boy's grip on her tightened like he was afraid she might disappear if he let go, and that's when I noticed the dried blood on his sleeve, dark and cracked, and something inside me snapped into place, pushing every doubt aside, because once you see that, once you really see it, you don't get to pretend you didn't. So without another word, I unlocked the side door of the garage and waved them inside. The space wasn't much to look at, just old tools hanging from crooked hooks, oil-stained floors that never really came clean, and a small space heater humming in the corner that barely kept the chill away. But it was dry and warm, and that mattered. And I grabbed my first aid kit, gently cleaning the boy's scrape while he winced but didn't cry, and when I handed him a soda from the old vending machine, his face lit up with a shy smile that broke through the fear for just a moment, and that alone felt worth everything. The woman introduced herself as Sarah, and she told me the boy's name was Ethan, but she didn't say much else, just that they were running from something dangerous and couldn't stay where they'd been, and I didn't press her, because kindness doesn't need a full story to be real. And I offered them soup from a diner down the street and a blanket I kept for nights when work ran long, and she tried to refuse, pride fighting desperation in her eyes, but I insisted, because some things aren't meant to be earned, they're meant to be given, and that night, they slept in the tiny office while I sat nearby pretending to read a magazine, though I wasn't really reading at all, just listening to the rain and making sure they were safe, because sometimes protection is just presence. When morning came, gray and quiet, Sarah looked at me with tears in her eyes and told me I didn't have to do any of this, and I told her I knew that, but I wanted to anyway, and over the next few days, they stayed close by, never asking for more than they needed, Sarah helping clean the garage, sweeping floors and organizing tools like she wanted to repay kindness with effort, and Ethan followed me around endlessly, asking question after question about engines and bolts and why cars made certain sounds, laughing when I let him honk a horn just once, and for a while, it felt almost normal, like a broken family accidentally finding shelter inside another one without meaning to. One afternoon, everything changed, because two black SUVs rolled to a stop outside the garage, sleek and out of place against the cracked pavement and rusted signs, and men in dark suits stepped out, the kind of men who didn't belong anywhere they couldn't control, and my heart dropped straight into my stomach, because I knew instantly that trouble had finally caught up to us, and Sarah's face went pale for just a second before she squared her shoulders and whispered to me that it was okay. And when the men approached, they didn't grab her or raise their voices, they addressed her with respect, calling her ma'am, telling her they'd been searching everywhere, and that's when the truth finally spilled out, piece by piece, like a weight lifting and crushing at the same time, because Sarah wasn't just some beaten woman on the run, she was the widow of a powerful oil tycoon, a man whose empire stretched farther than I could imagine, and when he died months earlier, he left behind not just wealth, but enemies, and when she refused to sell the company, threats turned into violence, and she ran to protect her son, because Ethan wasn't just a kid hiding in my garage, he was an heir, and standing there with oil-stained hands and a life built on survival. None of it made sense to me, and before they left, Sarah hugged me tightly and told me that if I hadn't helped them that night, she didn't know if they'd be alive, and a week later, a lawyer showed up at my garage, and I thought it had to be some kind of mistake, because people like me didn't get visits like that, but it wasn't, and Sarah hadn't offered charity, she'd offered opportunity, funding my garage, turning it into a full-service shop, making sure Lily's education was secure, not giving me millions, but giving me dignity, and months passed and life changed, but I stayed the same, and one day, a letter arrived with a photo of Ethan smiling, holding a small toy wrench, and on the back it said he wanted to fix cars like me someday, and I cried, not because of money or success, but because kindness had come full circle, because I helped them when they were broken, and they helped me stand taller, and somewhere along the way, a scared little boy learned what compassion looks like, and that's the truth, you never know who you're helping, you never know what story hides behind bruises and silence and fear, because kindness doesn't ask for titles or rewards, it just shows up, and sometimes, it changes everything, and if this story touched your heart, share it, like it, and remember that kindness is never wasted, it always finds its way back, and this is Storyverse, reminding you that even the smallest act of compassion can rewrite a destiny. Chapter 2. After the SUVs pulled away and the sound of their engines faded into the distance, the garage felt strangely hollow, like something essential had been removed from the air itself, and I stood there for a long moment staring at the oil-streaked floor, replaying every second of the past few days in my head, wondering how a life like mine had brushed up against something so big and dangerous and surreal, because nothing about my world prepared me for that kind of revelation, and yet, when I unlocked my front door later that night and Lily ran into my arms with her usual laugh, everything snapped back into place, reminding me that no matter how strange things got, my responsibility was still right there in front of me, small and warm and trusting. For a while, I told myself that chapter was closed, that Sarah and Ethan would disappear back into a world that never would have crossed paths with mine again, and that I'd return to fixing cars and counting dollars and stretching dinners just a little further. But life doesn't always respect the neat endings we imagine, and a week later, just as I was finishing up an oil change under a flickering fluorescent light, a clean black sedan pulled up outside the garage, and my chest tightened before I even wiped my hands, because I recognized that feeling now, that quiet warning that something bigger than me was stepping back into my life. The man who walked in didn't look threatening, just professional, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a calm expression that didn't belong in my world of grease and grit. And when he said my name, I almost laughed, because I hadn't told it to many people, and definitely not anyone who drove a car like that. And he explained he was a lawyer, speaking on Sarah's behalf, and that she wanted to repay me, and that word made me uncomfortable immediately, because I didn't help them for repayment, I helped them because it was right, and I told him as much, but he smiled gently and said she understood that better than anyone, and that what she was offering wasn't charity, it was a chance. Over the next hour, he laid out plans I barely understood at first, talking about investment and expansion and turning my small, struggling operation into a full-service auto shop, not with flashy signs or corporate nonsense, but with solid equipment, fair wages, and a future that didn't feel like it could collapse with one bad week. And when he mentioned Lily, and the way Sarah wanted to make sure her education was protected no matter what happened to me, my throat closed up, because that was the fear I carried every day without admitting it, the fear of leaving my daughter with nothing but unfinished repairs and unpaid bills. I didn't sign anything that day, not right away, because dignity matters, and I needed time to believe this was real, but when the papers finally did get signed, nothing about me changed overnight except the weight on my shoulders got lighter, and the garage slowly transformed, piece by piece, new lifts installed, better tools replacing the ones held together by tape and hope, a fresh coat of paint covering years of wear, and people started coming in not just because they had to, but because they trusted the place, and I hired 2 guys from the neighborhood who needed work just as badly as I once had, and for the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was building something. Lily noticed it too, even if she didn't understand the details. She noticed that I smiled more, that I wasn't as tired, that I had the energy to help with homework and sit through cartoons without drifting off, and sometimes at night, after she fell asleep, I'd sit at the kitchen table thinking about how close everything had come to staying the same forever, how one decision in the rain had shifted the ground beneath my feet. Sarah stayed in touch, not constantly, not intrusively, but enough to remind me that what we shared wasn't a transaction, it was a connection, and once, months later, I got a letter with no return address, just a photo tucked inside, Ethan grinning ear to ear, holding a small toy wrench like it was treasure, and on the back, in uneven handwriting, he'd written that he wanted to fix cars like me when he grew up, and I sat there longer than I meant to, staring at that photo until my vision blurred, because in a world that measures worth in money and power, that small gesture felt heavier than any check could have. I thought often about that night in the rain, about how easily I could have driven past, about how fear almost won, and how close I came to choosing comfort over compassion, and I wondered how many stories I'd already missed in my life by doing just that, how many chances the world gives us to step outside ourselves and quietly matter to someone else, and the truth settled into me slowly but firmly, that kindness doesn't announce itself, it doesn't ask permission, it just shows up when it's needed most, and sometimes it plants seeds we'll never fully see grow. The garage became more than a business, it became a place people talked, where stories were shared while engines cooled and coffee went cold, and I listened more than I used to, because I'd learned how much could be hidden behind tired eyes and guarded expressions, and every once in a while, when the rain hit the pavement just right, I'd hear echoes of that first night, and I'd remember the sound of a child crying in the dark, and how close I came to missing it, and I promised myself I wouldn't make that mistake again. Because life doesn't always give us the chance to be heroes, but it often gives us the chance to be decent, and that's where real change begins. Time has a way of moving quietly when life finally settles into something steady, and the months that followed didn't arrive with fireworks or grand announcements. They came in small, meaningful moments, in mornings where the garage door rolled up smoothly instead of sticking, in afternoons where laughter echoed between tool chests, in evenings where I came home with enough energy left to really listen when Lily talked about her day, and even though my circumstances had changed, the memory of where I started never left me, because I carried that night in the rain with me like a compass, reminding me how fragile everything really is and how quickly the path can shift when someone chooses to care. People sometimes assume that once help arrives, once success follows struggle, fear disappears, but that isn't how it works, because even with stability, I still thought about how close I came to staying invisible, how easily my life could have remained a narrow loop of exhaustion and quiet resignation, and that awareness sharpened my sense of responsibility, not just to my daughter, but to the world I was now more firmly rooted in. Lily grew taller, more curious, asking questions about everything from engines to ethics, and one night, as I tucked her into bed, she asked me why I helped the woman and the boy when I didn't even know them, and I told her the truth, that sometimes you don't help because you know how things will turn out, you help because you hope someone would do the same for you, and she nodded like that made perfect sense, because kids understand fairness in ways adults often forget. The garage became a reflection of that philosophy, a place where people were treated honestly, where mistakes were owned, where no one was talked down to for not knowing what was wrong under the hood, and word spread slowly but surely, not because of advertising, but because trust travels farther than noise, and there were days when I'd pause in the middle of work, hands resting on a warm engine block, and just take in the sound of it all, the hum of activity, the quiet conversations, the ordinary miracles of people helping people without needing a spotlight. Every so often, I heard updates about Sarah and Ethan through brief messages, never details, just reassurances that they were safe, rebuilding, finding their footing again in a world that had tried to tear them apart, and knowing that gave me a sense of peace I hadn't expected, because their story was no longer frozen in fear for me, it had continued, just like mine. One afternoon, long after the shock had faded and routine had settled in, I received another letter, thinner this time, handwritten, and inside was a simple note from Sarah thanking me again, not for the garage or the shelter or the night of safety, but for reminding her son that strangers can be good, that compassion can exist even when everything else falls apart, and I sat there holding that letter, realizing that the most valuable thing I'd given them wasn't protection or warmth, it was proof that the world hadn't completely abandoned them. I thought back to the way Ethan used to trail behind me, eyes wide, absorbing every detail, and I wondered what kind of man he'd grow into carrying that memory with him, and I hoped that when the moment came, he'd choose kindness too, not because it paid off, but because it mattered. Years from now, people might look at my shop and assume it was always meant to succeed, that I had some plan or advantage from the start, but the truth is quieter and harder to explain, because it began with a choice made in the rain by a tired man who almost kept driving, and that's how most meaningful things begin, not with confidence, but with hesitation followed by courage. I never saw myself as a hero, and I still don't, because heroes are rare and dramatic, but decency is available to anyone willing to stop and listen, and if there's one thing this life taught me, it's that you never really know who you're helping, you never fully understand the weight someone else is carrying until you help lift it for a moment, and kindness doesn't need to be loud or perfect or even recognized, it just needs to be real. Somewhere out there, a boy who once slept on a garage office floor is growing up with a different understanding of the world, and somewhere here, a single father learned that doing the right thing doesn't just change someone else's life, it reshapes your own in ways you couldn't plan if you tried, and that's why I tell this story, not to impress, not to inspire pity or praise, but to remind anyone listening that the smallest act of compassion can ripple farther than you'll ever see, because kindness never disappears, it just travels, and sooner or later, it finds its way back. This is Storyverse, and if this story stayed with you, share it, carry it forward, and remember that even in the darkest moments, one choice can quietly rewrite a destiny.